The program this evening, and especially for Mother's Day week, moms get a week, they get a month, they should get everything. Mother, hidden histories of the women in the Poe family. I hope that our moms in the audience did have a happy Mother's Day this past weekend. I will be providing a very brief overview of the life of Edgar and Virginia Poe and the Poe family's connection to Baltimore, and a graveside chat with J. Scat Watkins, who is here this evening, to talk about the life of David Poe Sr. and wife Elizabeth Cairnes Poe. We are followed by Kalin Thomas and Dr. Amy Rosenkrans from the Maryland Women's Heritage Center to share more stories of Baltimore mothers, real and true women. We'll conclude with a special presentation by Evan Dennis, who's here with the Enoch Pratt Free Library, who will give us a peek at the wonderful array of items in the Edgar Alln Poe Special Collection at Enoch Pratt Free Library. And if you have an opportunity to visit the Poe Room, have an opportunity to be in the space with that collection, it really is quite amazing. So again, I will give the quickest overview so we can get to our speakers. Edgar Alln Poe is one of the world's most famous writers, known for the poem The Raven and masterful Gothic and macabre tales such as The Telltale Heart, Casa Amontillado, among others. He is also the father of the detective story, establishing the very template for such a character, solving a mystery by way of deductive reasoning and keen observation. I am getting more Google alerts these days that the old fight over which city loves Poe more starting to pop up a little bit, especially after the Poe Museum in Richmond just had their 100th birthday, reviving an old struggle about who has the strongest claim to Edgar Alln Poe. Well, they can say what they like. He lives here, he's buried here. And we're here to talk about those Baltimore roots. The son of traveling actors, Poe was born in Boston, later orphaned and raised by a foster family in Richmond, and even raised for a brief time in London, England. But Poe's father's family was from Baltimore, and it is here he finds refuge with blood relatives after he becomes estranged from the foster family, the Allens in Richmond. Visitors to Baltimore will find that the city identifies deeply with the iconic figure that Poe has become. Brief plug for Poe House as well, as we are the last surviving home in Baltimore where the Poe family were known to have lived, and this is the house where Poe makes his chosen family. We're open for tours every Thursday through Sunday from 11 to 4, and we hope you come and see us. But this is why we're here. Poe famously marries his first cousin, Virginia Clem, a young woman of some beauty and talent, but compared to her wildly famous husband, not much is known about her, except that she dies young, and she is beautiful. The nature of their marriage is debated by Poe scholars because the history is fraught and controversial, for reasons not the least of these, that Virginia is only 13 years old when she's pressed to marry her first cousin. Virginia Eliza Clem Poe was born in Maryland August 15, 1822. She dies of consumption in 1847 at just 24 years old after protracted and painful illness. And during this time, her husband publishes The Raven, a Gothic and romantic poem that captures the imagination of the world and makes him popularly famous. Had Poe himself not drawn a direct line from his work to this idea of a beautiful dying woman as the most poetical topic in the world, sadly, there might not be much reason to talk about Virginia. But it is precisely the absence of her voice within such a controversial, iconic writer's history that this year, Virginia's 200th birthday, we look deeper and try to discover if there's more to her story. And as the saying goes, behind every great man and woman is a mother. Virginia and Edgar never had children, but their first and last home together would be made with Maria Poe Clem, Virginia's mother and Poe's aunt. And their home was at first made possible by the patriotism and devotion of a Revolutionary War grandmother, Elizabeth Cairnes Poe. We are joined this evening, I'm so very pleased to see him in the audience, to answer some questions as well. J. Scott Watkins is a living history performer, voice and screen actor, and presenter in Baltimore, Maryland. He frequently appears as Lord Baltimore for Maryland Day and other historic celebrations. We recorded a graveside chat with Scott that streamed this past Sunday on Mother's Day, and we encourage everyone to visit our YouTube channel to see the complete recording. And in a strange and glorious coincidence for this program, Scott is also a direct descendant of the same cemetery sextons who buried both Virginia and Edgar at Westminster Hall.
Hello, I'm David Poe Sr. I was born in Coven, Ireland, and my parents came into Baltimore in the 1750s, where eventually I became a wheelwright and began making spinning wheels and all sorts of carriage wheels, and also opening up a dry goods merchant service.
I was born in Dringtownland, Kildallan Parish, County Kevin, Ireland, in 1742. My father, John Poe, and my mother, Jane McBride, moved to Baltimore in the 1750s. I am a Presbyterian of Scots-Irish background. I married Elizabeth Cairnes in 1775. Our children were John Hancock Poe, William Adam Poe, George Washington Poe, David Poe Jr., Samuel Poe, and Maria Poe. We lived on Market Street, where I practiced my trade as a wheelwright and ran a dry goods store. When the War for Independence began, my brothers George, John, and I enlisted in the militia.
They made me Deputy Quartermaster General. They used to call me affectionately the General, but it was actually only a Major.
The duties of a quartermaster are many and very demanding. We are responsible for everything, including clothing, food, camp supplies, weapons, ammunition, dealing with civilian merchants, transport, and even selecting battlegrounds and drawing up orders of battle. As well, we also take the right position on the field of battle. I was a compatriot to Gilbert de Motier, also known as the Marquis de Lafayette. When the French army encamped in Baltimore on their way to Yorktown, they needed 500 pairs of pantaloons. My wife Elizabeth Cairnes enlisted many ladies with the talents of a seamstress to meet the demand. The ladies met in the assembly rooms and completed the order. The women during the Revolution were vital in securing our victory, from nursing to fighting to maintaining farms and other food supplies. The War of Independence would not have been won without our women.
My brothers George and John Poe also fought in the American Revolution. They were in McClellan's company and were at the Battle of Germantown, just outside of Philadelphia.
Our devotion to liberty cost us much. John was captured and died on the prison ship Jersey.
When the Continental Army needed money for supplies and they didn't have it, I gave $40,000 of my own money to fund whatever they needed. I never got repaid for it, but in my heart I did believe in liberty. I did believe in the United States.
Together with my wife Elizabeth, we gave much to build this city, this state, and this nation, but I died nearly penniless in 1816. When years later the Marquis de Lafayette returned to Baltimore, he asked for me, his friend David Poe. When he learned of my death, he asked for my widow and visited my grave. When he saw my poor Elizabeth bedridden and destitute in the care of our daughter Maria, he shamed the city fathers into giving her a pension. My daughter Maria, a widow herself and caring for 2 small children of her own, moved the family to Amity Street at the edge of the city to escape a cholera epidemic in 1832. If it wasn't for the pension our family finally received for our service in the American Revolution, there would have been no rent money to pay for the house on 3 Amity Street. My grandson Edgar would find a home with them there. This home would provide him refuge and freedom to pen his early works.
Now to Baltimore mothers, real and true women. Before I introduce our next 2 presenters, I did want to stop a moment to recognize and share with everyone a brief history of Maria Poe, Clem's life. This is Virginia's mother and Edgar Alln Poe's aunt, who, as you're about to learn when we hear Kalin Thomas present, would be quite dear to Edgar. Poe's aunt, and after he married his cousin Virginia, his mother-in-law, Poe called her Muddy. Although there is some debate as to whether or not she was a positive influence on Edgar, there seems no doubt that she cared for him like a son, and that Poe certainly thought of her as a mother. This is the first paragraph from the Edgar Allan Poe Society of Baltimore page on Maria Clem. And as we just heard, the devotion of the Poe women made quite a bit possible for the young writer. Maria Clem famously opened her home to her nephew. For the love of her late brother, for the sake of their blood tie, perhaps, maybe, yes, this is an extraordinary act of kindness, to welcome a veritable stranger in, to care for him as you would, as you do, your own children. But since coming to Poe, I have become fascinated by the generally negative tenor of the opinions expressed about Maria Clem. A grasping woman, no stranger to poverty, often begging her late husband's acquaintances, not just friends, for help. This grasping in her nature, the coldness to those not in her circle, these hints of cruelty, sometimes calculation and duality, is chief among her quoted sins. And she found a compatriot in her nephew, Edgar, who even at a young age knew how to turn a pitiful phrase in letters begging for money from John Allen. This disdain for poverty hits differently, cruelly, as we understand more of the family situation. But all of that was for them, the world outside. Anyone not within the triumvirate that included Eddie, Muddy, and Sissy, Edgar's pet name for Virginia. Virginia dies only 10 years after her marriage to Edgar, after a long, protracted battle with tuberculosis, and even after her passing, Edgar and Maria keep a home together. I picture the two of them and try to imagine these people, not just bound by blood, but who chose one another and keep true to this family for the rest of their lives. And it was a very deliberate choice that bound them. We are cautioned not to commit the sin of presentism, that is, not to judge people from the past in a contemporary context. I have personal feelings about whether that's truly the sin that historians say it is, but there are some serious moral issues with the marriage of a 13-year-old girl to a man twice her age, no matter the century. Even in this situation, it is important to note the culpability of the adults in the room, and that includes Virginia's mother, Maria. And the situation is this. With her mother's death in 1833, Maria Clem and family's primary income is wiped out. Edgar, at this time, age 26, has moved from Baltimore back to Richmond to pursue a job as an editor at the Southern Literary Messenger, and there is no record of what has happened to Maria's son, Henry. So here is Maria, a widow in her 40s, alone, no prospects, no money, no longer able to afford the rent at Amity Street, and it seems that Edgar had expressed a desire to marry Virginia, eventually. A prospect that deeply unsettled members of the Poe family when they heard of it. Still, whether the marriage would have happened at this precise time, had the family not come to this critical financial crossroads, is not certain. But then a cousin makes an offer. Nielsen Poe, another cousin here in Baltimore, only 5 days younger than Edgar, but by contrast, married, settled, and eager to prevent a premature marriage, offers to allow Virginia to stay with his family, to be raised and educated properly, to later enter society as a young lady of promise. The only catch, there's some question about whether her mother is part of the deal. A loving mother might have let her daughter go on to live the good life, for she could not provide for her. A loving mother might have wanted a better life for her daughter. A loving mother might have wanted to give her daughter a little more time to be a girl. And a loving mother might have believed, truly, that no money, no dresses, no good graces would ever be better for a girl than a life together with her mother. Maria's choice would seal her daughter's fate. Who could have known that? The fate that Maria had perhaps tried to avoid in marrying her daughter Virginia to Edgar unfortunately comes to pass after all. After her nephew's death, Maria Poe Clem would never again be the mistress of her own home and would now be cast upon the kindness of strangers, staying in the homes of those who had loved or admired her nephew, I should say, flattering an eager hostess here and there with the promise that, of course, yes, you were my darling Eddie's Annabelle Lee. She lived with various families in cities in New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Virginia, Pennsylvania, even Ohio. 14 years later, she would return home to Baltimore, only to find none waiting for her here. With no money for the Baltimore Widow's Home, she would die at Episcopal Church Home in the very same building as her nephew, Edgar Alln Poe. Her devotion did not waver. Her final wish was to be buried at her darling Eddie's side. And when he was given his new monument here at Westminster, dug up from an unmarked grave at the back to a place of honor at the front, Mariah would make that trip with him. When you exit tonight and tip your hat to Edgar, you'll look back, stare at thought, and remember Muddy's devotion and how a mother's love changed literary history. And with that, I will introduce Kalin Thomas. Kalin is an award-winning multimedia storyteller who gets geeked out about cultural heritage tourism, traditions, and preservation. A former producer and correspondent for CNN's weekly travel program, she is currently writing a book of her travels entitled, "Do You Know She's Black?" Musings of CNN's first Black travel reporter. And Kalin will read an apropos selection for us now.
Thank you, Enrica. So I have the honor of reading a poem entitled "To My Mother" by Edgar Allan Poe, and it'll give you an idea of how devoted he was to his aunt/mother-in-law compared to how he felt about his own mother. Because I feel that in the heavens above, the angels whispering to one another can find among their burning terms of love none so devotional as that of mother. Therefore, by that dear name I long have called you, you who are more than mother unto me, and fill my heart of hearts where death installed you, in setting my Virginia's spirit free. My mother, my own mother, who died early, was but the mother of myself. But you are mother to the one I loved so dearly, and thus are dearer than the mother I knew. But that by that infinity with which my wife was dearer to my soul than its soul life.
Thank you, Cam. Dr. Amy Rosenkrans is a lifelong resident in Havre de Grace and received her PhD from Notre Dame, where she wrote a dissertation that I believe includes history of one of the very orphanages you'll be talking about this evening. She's a member of the Maryland Women's Heritage Center Executive Board, currently at work documenting Maryland suffragists, and we're very pleased to welcome her to the podium now.
Good evening. I'm excited to be here tonight to talk about Baltimore mothers, real and true women. When we talk about women's history and we talk about the 19th century, we often talk about the cult of true womanhood or the cult of domesticity. And this is the idea that the ideal woman of the 19th century was meant to be a wife and a mother. And she was expected to embody the characteristics of piety, purity, submissiveness, and domesticity. Now, those were the ideals of what men expected, but that was not the reality of what happened within the actual lives of most women in the United States. I'm going to be talking to you today about two contemporaries of Mariah Clem and how they either lived or did not live up to those qualities of piety, purity, submissiveness, and domesticity. First of all, we're going to look at Mary Young Pickersgill. Mary Pickersgill was born in Philadelphia. She married John Pickersgill in Philadelphia at the age of 19, and the couple had a daughter by the name of Carolyn. Mary worked with her mother often in her mother's business, which was a flag making business in Philadelphia. She began her life her married life, fitting that true idea of domesticity, being at home as a wife and a mother. But eventually, quite quickly actually, her husband died and she was widowed at the age of 29. Resting on the experiences that she had with her mother. As a matter of fact, her mother had had the experience of being widowed early, and she set up a flag shop in Philadelphia. So Mary Pickersgill was very familiar with entrepreneurship. And by 1806, she comes to Baltimore. And this is why we claim Mary Pickersgill as our own here in Baltimore. She comes to Baltimore and she moves to East Pratt Street. And there she sets up a flag making business where she becomes very well known, making flags, making ensigns for the various ships in Baltimore City. When the War of 1812 comes along, her name is one of the top people that a gentleman by the name of Joshua Barnes. The longest option. She's not a mother in the Philadelphia. She married John Pickersgill in Philadelphia at the age of 19, and the couple had a daughter by the name of Carolyn. Mary worked with her mother often in her mother's business, which was a flag making business in Philadelphia. She began her life her married life, fitting that true idea of domesticity, being at home as a wife and a mother. But eventually, quite quickly actually, her husband died and she was widowed at the age of 29. Resting on the experiences that she had with her mother. As a matter of fact, her mother had had the experience of being widowed early, and she set up a flag shop in Philadelphia. So Mary Pickersgill was very familiar with entrepreneurship. And by 1806, she comes to Baltimore. And this is why we claim Mary Pickersgill as our own here in Baltimore. She comes to Baltimore and she moves to East Pratt Street. And there she sets up a flag making business where she becomes very well known, making flags, making ensigns for the various ships in Baltimore City. When the War of 1812 comes along, her name is one of the top people that a gentleman by the name of Joshua Barney and Major George Armistead come to when they're looking for a new flag. Commodore Joshua Barney said that he wanted a flag so large that the British would have no difficulty seeing it from a distance. So he hired Mary Pickersgill to create that flag. Being the entrepreneur that she was, she took that job on. She did quite a bit of work. She hired a number of people, and she made, with the help of a number of people, including enslaved and indentured and free Black women, the 30 by 42 foot flag that would fly over Fort McHenry during the Battle of Baltimore. By 1820, she has become so successful that she's able to buy that house on Pratt Street, and she's employed a number of women in her flag making business. That entrepreneurship is definitely not that home sphere that theory of domestic womanhood is, but she was successful, and so successful that she also steps out of her sphere and becomes a philanthropist. She, along with a number of other women, found the Impartial Female Humane Society, and those women together create the Widow's Home, or the Aged Widow's Home that you see here, that was established in Baltimore in 1851 to help take care of the deserving widow and the deserted wife. 10 years later, they're also going to establish an aged men's home to help men who are in those same straits and same situations. So Mary Pickersgill is not your traditional pious, pure, submissive, domestic wife, but she's one of our special Baltimore women, and like I mentioned, a contemporary of Mariah Clem. Her legacy is not only that grand old flag of the original aged women's home. Now, another woman who is considered one of our important mothers in Baltimore is Elizabeth Clarice Lang. Now, she's not a mother in the traditional sense of having her own children, but she is a mother. She's the Mother Superior of the Oblate Sisters of Providence. Elizabeth Clarice Lang was born in Cuba of a relatively wealthy family. She migrates here to Baltimore, and she's in Baltimore by 1813. So she's here when Mary Pickersgill is sewing the flag, and she migrates into Baltimore and lives in the Fells Point community, where she's living and working with the Haitian refugee community, which is a predominantly Catholic, African or Black community in Fells Point. She and a Haitian refugee found a school for the Black Catholic children in the neighborhood, and they come to the attention of several of the prominent Catholic leaders in Baltimore. Together with two other refugees from Haiti, or what was then Saint-Domingue, they found the Oblate Sisters of Providence, which is the first religious order of women of African descent. Obviously, Mother Mary Lang fits that idea of the pious woman, but she's out there in a second sphere, and she and the other sisters are working to create a place where African American or Black children can learn. The Oblate Rule, which is the rule that the Oblates founded themselves on, and it was their mission, was to educate Christian colored children. And they did that in a number of ways by founding the Oblate School for Colored Girls, which was originally in St. Mary's Court here in Baltimore City. And you can see there, they are holding on to this idea of the cult of domesticity, because their goal in educating these young women was that they were going to become mothers. And if they were not going to become mothers, they would be domestic servants in households, and they would be working to bring up young children in a Christian manner. The Oblate School for Colored Girls eventually will change its name to St. Francis School for Colored Girls, and will move over to East Chase Street. And again, the idea is to educate these young women to either be working in respectable homes or to be Christian mothers. And a lot of the education that they had was not just the 3 R's, but it was also learning French and fine needlework. They learned those domestic skills that were very important to all women in society at the time. Another interesting thing that happens, and we already heard about the cholera epidemic of 1832 that Mariah Clem lived through, the Oblate Sisters were asked by the Archdiocese to help nurse the Black victims of the cholera epidemic. So once again, this idea that women are supposed to be nursing their community, they are asked to nurse the Black community. And this is quite a quandary for them because Mother Mary Lang says, well, our mission, as we already saw, the Oblate Rule, is to be educators. We are not nurses like the Sisters of Charity. But they prayed on it, and eventually they will decide that they will indeed help nurse. And they actually worked in with the Archbishop. They helped nurse the Archbishop back to health. But they only did so by making sure that the Archbishop knew that, okay, we're going to do this now. We're doing this because we think we're needed, but we want you to know that we have our own things that we are doing too. But because we are members of this society, we want to help out. We will help nurse during the epidemic. Several of the oblates will die as a result of this. Again, this is the idea of society thinking that the oblates and women should be doing the nursing. The Oblate Sisters will also have an incredible legacy here in Baltimore and in our country. Their school, the original school, St. Francis Academy, is still in existence here in East Baltimore. It became co-educational in 1974, and it is one of the longest operating African-American schools in the country. And Mother Mary Lang is currently up for sainthood. So we're talking about these ideas of being pious, pure, submissive, and domestic, while Mariah Clem, Mary Pickersgill, Mother Mary Lang may not have fit all of those bills. They fit even more bills and have done an enormous service for us here in Baltimore and the world. So yes, they are still real and true women of Baltimore.
Now we'll move on to Act 3, Virginia Poe Artifacts at Enoch Pratt Free Library. We're joined this evening by Evan Dennis. Evan Dennis is the manager of the Special Collections Department at Enoch Pratt Free Library, where he is the steward of the Edgar Alln Poe collection, among other manuscript, photograph, and rare book collections. Now, this is my first time meeting Evan, though we were thrilled to work with Enoch Pratt 2 years ago during the Poe Festival when everything was virtual, and they contributed to our virtual program. But it is a collaboration that we enjoy, that we are looking forward to continuing and hope to put this on display, as it were, later this year when we talk about the Virginia Edgar death exhibit this August. So welcome, Evan.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here tonight. Like Enrica was saying, I'm at the Pratt Free Library, and I'm the Special Collections Librarian. And what that means is special collections, if you're not familiar, manuscripts, rare books, photos, unique items, items that require special care, they're fragile. We are known for having this Poe collection. Pratt, it's one of our most notable collections. And you might ask why. Thank you. The Poe Room actually opened up on the second floor of our 400 Cathedral Street Central Library, opened up in 1934 under the direction of Joseph Wheeler. And that was the 125th anniversary of Poe's birth. And that basically marked the inception of this relationship between our collective memory of Poe and the library. Dr. Wheeler was quoted saying, "Our idea was to make the Poe Room a living memorial to the great genius who stimulated American literature." Here is a pic of what the Poe Room looks like now. Next slide, please. And you can see the famous Thomas Cromwell corner painting in both images. We also have some artifacts on display, and you can see this Edgar Alln Poe timeline. We had some students in this day. Before I talk to you about the collection, I briefly want to talk about accessibility. So, like I said, we have special collections that are irreplaceable. So everything in our library is accessible, but we have to think about it a little bit differently than the books you pull off the shelf. We have to think about accessibility in terms of 200 years in the future and balance that with immediate access. So we provide access in a few different ways. First, to see the original items, we don't require, but we ask people to make appointments. But there are many other ways that we make special collections available to the public. And that's kind of based on the type of researcher that we have. We have some academics that are writing books about Poe. We have some people that love Poe and they want to have a tactile experience with Edgar Alln Poe, with the works of Edgar Alln Poe, let me say. We have student groups, obviously, and we have people that just walk in off the street that have already gone to the Poe House and they've already come here to see Poe's grave, and they just walk into the library and say, "What kind of Poe material do you have?" So we provide access. For the academics, people that want to see something, we do set up appointments and let you look at the original materials. But for people that walk in off the street, we also have, we provide access by creating facsimiles of the original documents that we pull out. We also offer some of the, about 40 items, I guess, in the collection It's about 11 boxes plus a rare book collection. About 40 items are on digital Maryland, which I'll show you at the end of the slides here. And we have this exhibit right outside the Poe room, which I'd like to talk about real quickly. Basically, this is called The Life and Legacy of Edgar Allan Poe, and it puts some of our collection in context. The intro panel has, it shows some of like the breadth of the collection in terms of the rare books and the different translations, scholarly works. But the meat of the exhibit, oh yeah, this is the right slide for that, thank you. It's basically broken up into 3 sections that are loosely built around the theme of the women in Edgar Allan Poe's life and how they shaped his legacy. One section about his literary influence, who he was influenced by. There's a rare edition of Frankenstein. We talk about Mary Shelley in that section. One section is about Sarah Sigourney Rice. I always want to say Sarah Sigourney Weaver. I'll try not to do that tonight. One section on Sarah Sigourney Rice, the school teacher who helped have his grave relocated. And the last section is about his legacy and how Rufus Griswold tarnished it. Poets Sarah Whitman and Sarah Rice tried to reclaim his tarnished legacy, but we touch on that a little in the 3rd section. But what we have, so we have this collection, and it's based on things that we have this exhibit based on actual items in our collection. You can go to the next slide, please. So when I say Edgar Allan Poe collection, it's also kind of a misnomer. Usually in archives and special collections, we name collections based on who compiled the material, so the Edgar Allan Poe collection is actually an umbrella term for lots of different donations we've had over the years. One is the Amelia Poe collection. Amelia was the daughter of Judge Nelson Poe, the second cousin of Edgar, and his name's all over the manuscript collection as a subject of conversation and as a correspondent. Amelia Poe left the collection to Reverend Nelson Poe Carey, who upon his death, it went to Margaret Cheston Carey with the provision that the collection come to a public institution, that it be available to the general public. So again, access was key in the donation of the Amelia Poe collection. And that's the most significant part of the collection. It contains the bulk of the manuscripts that are written in Edgar Allan Poe's hand. So it's very special. It's broken up. We have correspondence of Edgar Allan Poe, correspondence of Maria Clem, family papers, and some more ephemeral clippings and some more ephemeral objects. This is probably the most, I'd say this is probably the most notable letter in the collection. This is the letter in which Edgar writes to Maria Clem asking for Virginia's hand in marriage. And like we touched on earlier, how much agency she had in that is a different question for sure. If you go to the next slide, this one begins with Edgar stating, "I'm blinded by tears while writing this letter. I have no wish to live another hour." And it's in response to Nelson trying to prevent or postpone the marriage. Edgar called him his bitterest enemy and interpreted his cousin's actions as an attempt to break his connection with Virginia. So the anxiety expressed in the letter ends with, "Let me have under her own hand a letter bidding me goodbye forever, and I may die, my heart will break, I'll say no more." He's pleading that Maria allow Virginia to make her own decision. Again, how much of a decision was hers, we don't know. But whether the melodramatic letter worked or whether it's recent employment worked, they did get married, obviously. Marriage lasted for 11 years until she died of tuberculosis. The next letter, this is perhaps no primary documents drawn as much attention to solving the mystery of Poe's death as this letter from the attending physician, Dr. J.J. Moran, who's with Poe in his last days and hours. It should be noted that his stories varied over the years, but he insisted that alcohol wasn't involved with the death. He thought Poe had been the victim of a physical attack and that sustained injuries. He asked Poe, where were you? Why were you in Baltimore? Where were you these last 6 days? We know he didn't get much of an answer. And this letter from November 15th that we're looking at not only relays his condolences to Maria Clem, but it's the letter where he mentions Poe having active delirium and talking to spirits, having vacant converse with spectral and imaginary objects on the walls. And this is the letter where he famously mentions the name Reynolds before he dies. So the highlight of the collection for tonight, at least, is this poem from, oh, we can go to the next one. Thank you. This is the only known manuscript that I know of that exists from Virginia Poe, who by all accounts wasn't even too keen on poetry, maybe not even her husband's, which is funny. And this is an acrostic poem written February 14th, 1846, called the Valentine's Day poem. By acrostic, you can see it spells out the name Edgar Alln Poe. The first letter of every line spells out the name Edgar Alln Poe. Ever with thee I wish to roam, dearest, my life is thine. Give me a cottage for my home and a rich old cypress vine. Removed from the world with its sin and care and the tattling of many tongues, love alone shall guide us when we are there. Love shall heal my weakened lungs. And oh, the tranquil hours we'll spend, never wishing that others may see. Perfect ease we'll enjoy without thinking to lend ourselves to the world and its glee. Ever peaceful and blissful will be. So it's a simple poem expressing, hopes for their love, and she was hoping that love would heal her weakened lungs. So it's quite tragic and poignant, I guess. She would die less than a year later, or the following year, from tuberculosis. The most notable line in this poem that people talk about is the tattling of tongues. And that this references an event, according to several authors, about a somewhat vindictive poet named Elizabeth Elliot, who was jealous of Edgar Allan Poe and his relationship with, not Virginia, but with the poet Francis Sargent Osgood, who had a somewhat flirtatious correspondence with Edgar Allan Poe. It's a long story, but she gets involved, and I think it ends with Poe fighting her brother. I won't get into it tonight, but it's interesting because by all accounts, Virginia didn't have a problem with Poe's relationship with Francis Osgood. She thought she was a good influence on him. But anyhow, yeah, this is a sketch of Virginia in the poem. This is not a sketch of Virginia. This is what we pull out, and it makes all the teenagers go nuts every time they visit the library. We love to show this to them. But this, a gift of the Poe Society. These are clippings, obviously, of Virginia and Edgar Allan Poe. The hair, the curly hair on the right is Virginia's, and the one on the left is Edgar. And I believe this is the case because there's more of her hair in the collection. And that might be really weird to us today, but during the Victorian era, hair had symbolic value. We didn't all have smartphones with a zillion pictures of our loved ones. You had to clip their hair when they died to remember them. And the hair they're side by to this day. Word macabre is used a lot. This is soothing for that. But Edgar Allan Poe's lock was taken from his head after his death in 1849, and Virginia's lock arrived in a letter containing the Valentine poem. You go to the next slide, please. We also have this. This is the runner-up. This also gets book cited, and this is in one of the exhibits. This is a fragment from Poe's coffin that broke off during reinterment. And there are others floating around. Ours isn't the only one. I think it's a popular artifact. But I bring this up because this kind of segues to the other chunk of the collection, which is really relevant to where we are today. The next slide, please. The Sarah Sigourney Rice collection. Sarah Sigourney Rice was a Baltimore school teacher at Western Female High School. And she was the one that began the effort to reclaim Poe's reputation and wanted to give him an appropriate monument and reburial here at Westminster. Under the authority of the Public School Teachers Association, she and other teachers, they started this program, Pennies for Poe, for the purposes of erecting a monument and to reinter his remains. This is a scan, presumably it's Sarah Rice laying the wreath on at the unveiling of the Poe Monument in 1875. In the next one, I just have another picture of we have Pennies for Poe as part of the exhibit. You can see that. But my favorite part of the Sarah Rice collection, next slide, please, are these 3 letters from famous authors. So she was looking not only to raise funds for a new memorial, but she was also looking to have an epitaph written on Edgar Allan Poe's grave. She wrote to, of others, actually, William C. Bryant, Henry Longfellow, and Alfred Tennyson, and they all replied very coolly to her request, to say the least. Longfellow wanted an epitaph of Poe's poem to Annie, "The fever called living is conquered at last." And then he commented on his choice, you can probably find something better. He didn't say it like that. William Bryant had a really generic suggestion to Edgar Allan Poe, author of The Raven and other poems and works of fiction. Not the best epitaph. And Alfred Tennyson kind of dismissed the request altogether. So in the end, as you can go outside and see, there's no epitaph, but these letters document that. Next slide. Another huge chunk of the collection, the Joseph Katz donation. This was about 18 years after the Sarah Rice collection came to Enoch Pratt in 1960. It includes this bronze sculpture of Poe and this photo that's famously and falsely attributed to Civil War photographer Matthew Brady. But Mr. Katz, he was a Lithuanian immigrant, came to East Baltimore when he was 3, and he rose to become an advertising executive, started Joseph Katz and Company at 10 West Chase Street, and also was an important collector of rare 19th and early 20th century books. Would travel to antique rare book shops, antique shops all over the city on this endless quest to find books and fine art. So when he passed away, we have over 3,000 of his books came to our collection. Thank you. Some of the notable first editions, we have the first edition of The Raven from 1845. We have first editions of The Murder in the Rue Morgue from Graham's Magazine, The Pit and the Pendulum from The Gift in 1843. Quite a collection of rare books. The last manuscript I want to talk about tonight is a donation from Dr. Thomas Cullen, and this is in Edgar Allan Poe's hand, and it's not from the Amelia Poe collection, but it's a basically it's a copy of To One in Paradise written in Poe's hand and bound by Thomas Cullen, donated to the library. It has the first and last stanzas of the poem, and Poe had copied this and given this to another young cousin, Mary Estelle Herring, during one of his visits to the Herring home. This version notably differs from the commonly published version in that it says blue eye. In the published versions, you normally see gray eye. The guess is that maybe his young cousin had blue eyes, and that makes this a little bit unique and special. But this is, when people make appointments, I really like to bring this out because it's just a very handsome copy. To go on, access again, a lot of the copies I've talked about facsimiles. We do bring out the originals briefly if you want to see something that's actually in Poe's hand. If you're not in the library, you can go to digitalmaryland.org, and we have 40 or so items from the Edgar Allan Poe collection up there, and they're high resolution images that you can look at. We also have finding aids available. If you go to prattlibrary.org and under the special collections department, we have these finding aids, and those are basically roadmaps to how the collection's organized. So if you come in, you want to make an appointment and say, I want to see box 6. This has material that I'm researching or just interests me. We can pull that out for you. And lastly, yeah, my contact info is on this last slide. That's a whirlwind tour of the collection in 15 minutes. It's obviously much more than that, but please reach out, email, or call, and we're happy to make that available to you. Thanks for having me tonight.
To go in that cemetery is an amazing thing. To know about David Poe Sr., see his tombstone and see Reverend Patrick Allison right next to him. And you're wondering, well, who is Reverend Patrick Allison? He was the first chaplain to the Continental Congress and a personal friend of George Washington's. In fact, if you go up to First and Franklin Church further up the road, in the church, there is a walking stick that George Washington gave Reverend Patrick Allison. You go over a few other feet and you have General Sam Smith, who was not only a Revolutionary War hero, but he was the commander-in-chief of the Baltimore forces that saved the country at the Battle of North Point and the Battle of Fort McHenry. And to go in that little graveyard and just almost like being in a sort of, if you will, an eternal cocktail party. Everyone you bump into is somehow connected. I think for me, and relating it to Edgar Allan Poe and growing up hearing his works. And let's relate it also to the theme of this, the women. It is truly amazing what the women did of Poe's time, of his father's time, and of his grandfather's time. So much so that when I look at history now, I'm really always focusing on not only that individual, be it man or a woman, but also the people around them. And women really, truly, when you think about what they had to deal with, everything from, in many cases, very early on, not being allowed to own private property. It had to, go to their husband or the male figure in their family, and still just raising families and doing what they had to do when, the husband was away or going off to war or what have you. For me, doing living history and as being a film actor, I've done a number of period films. I was in Gods and Generals, a Warner Brothers production based on the Shara novels about the Civil War. I played General Colston in that, and that was a fascinating experience. I played Lord Baltimore, the third Lord Baltimore, Charles Calvert, and give lectures on the whole idea of early Maryland and how it developed. To also being in a movie called First Landing for the ABC Family Channel, which talks about the first settlers in Jamestown, which was a fascinating project to do. So I've always sort of had the history crossroad.
The work that I've done in the Oblate archives was that many of them were mostly in Fells Point, and that's where the school was that Mother Mary Lang conducted. But I'm happy to take that back to the archives and see what other documentation they have.
Well, I was brought into the board of the Maryland Women's Heritage Center by a sorority sister who is on the board. Her name is Danita, and she is also the vice president of the board. She is also the vice president of programming. So Danita and I are working together also with communications and programming, and I handle the Facebook page for the Maryland Women's Heritage Center. I've learned quite a bit about the women of Maryland who have done so many great things by being a part of this organization. I actually grew up in Baltimore, but lived in Atlanta for more than 30 years. So I just recently moved back here a few years ago and am having to relearn my own hometown. And a lot of times when you're from a place, you take a lot of the sites for granted. And now I'm starting to learn what a lot of these historical sites really mean to Baltimore. And so that's really been my honor and my pleasure to do that through the Maryland Women's Heritage Center.
So Mother Mary Lang is up for canonization. She's on the first level, I believe. I haven't caught up with it lately. There's several levels to becoming a saint. And she has hit the first mark of becoming a saint. And it's quite an experience. What has to happen is they have to apply to become a saint. The Mother Mary Lang Guild has put together information about why she should be a saint. If you are not Catholic, in order to be a saint, you have to have had so many miracles happen and they have to be documented. So the archives and the guild had to put together an entire almost dissertation on Mother Mary Lang and submit it to the Vatican. And then the Vatican had to come to Baltimore and review it and make sure that it was actually true and accurate. And now we're on those steps to go further to become Saint Mother Mary Lang, or Saint Mary Lang. I don't know what they would call her. But yes.
Saint Mother Mary.
Saint Mother Mary, I don't, Saint Mary Lang. But it's a fabulous story, and if you're interested, you should check out the Mother Mary Lang Guild and participate in that.
Wonderful, thank you. And do you have any upcoming projects with MWC that you have going on this year? Or is that's a full plate?
It is a full plate. We have been working on documenting the suffragist movement, and we are this summer, I'm going to be researching and working on the Women's Industrial Exchange Building and the history of that and the women that work there. So if anybody out there in Baltimore land would like to help us do that research, we would love to see you.
Yeah, this is our most popular collection. Like I mentioned, I spend quite a bit of time. More research questions about Poe come in than any. I'm a librarian and I'm a generalist by nature. So when I started at Enoch Pratt, I didn't know much more about Poe than your average, your average literature enthusiast, I guess. But my favorite thing about Poe is probably when we show getting the school kids excited about it. When we show the hair in the coffin it's hard to get through to students sometimes. So it's an easy win. So I guess that's what I get the most excited about.
Scaring little children.
That's another way you can say it. Yeah.
Excellent.
Oh, well, I'm just like any of you here. I'm a custodian really of just their history, or of Edgar Allan Poe's history. I really see history that is people as really gifts. Their lives, their past lives are for us to study and to learn from, both vices and virtues, the human experience. And I think that's what's important about history, that everything from Mother Mary Lang to the Poe family to anyone from this area or this country, they belong to all of us. Their lives are a profile, really, and courage, to steal a title from John F. Kennedy, but truly, that's what it means to me, to get to know my own family, but also the fact that they belong to, and the Poes and the Mother Mary Langs, they belong to us because we're Baltimoreans, and they are part of our collective story. So I kind of feel like the librarian here, the collection. I like to think of all the things that I'm learning here tonight, and what I know of my family is a huge library that I can pull from and learn something, about their lives, and maybe even use it in in my own. I think truly that history is for us, to fortify us for the future. That's why we have history. If it gives us lessons to face the future. And that is what history is all about, isn't it? It's about the story of change, of going into the future. And oftentimes it's a struggle, So that's what it means to me. Thank you. I know very little about his parents as actors, only in that I believe that his father was not a very good actor and suffered for that. And as well, I believe his mother, though, was quite beloved. But I have very little information on their, on their backgrounds as far as their notoriety.
Evan, did you want to step in, or I could? As Scott mentioned, Poe's mother was a noted and celebrated actress, and it actually is because of her presence on the stage and her light on the stage that the ladies in Richmond at the time of her death rally around her deathbed and are eager to help her. As a matter of fact, the theater appeals to the public on her behalf, saying that poor Mrs. Poe is alone and to please help. So unfortunately, David Poe Jr. not very, despite his aspirations, not a great performer. And this is one of the first mysteries of Poe's life. What happens to Dad? Poe's father, raised here in Baltimore to be something boring like a lawyer, and instead runs away with the theater, falls in love with a beautiful British actress by the name of Eliza. And however, the reviews that exist of his performances were quite dismal, and he disappears from the record, and his family here in Baltimore never hears from him again. And when Mrs. Poe, Eliza Poe's situation is explained to the public, there's really no mention of her husband. So what happened to Edgar's father is one of the first mysteries of Poe's life. But I hope that answers a little bit of the question. Quite a bit is known about Eliza. We have a helpful tip from the audience from Jeff Savoy that the Hobson Quinn biography of Poe does go into further detail about Mrs. Poe, Poe, Edgar's mother.
I do have a website, KalinThomas.com, and most of what's on there are articles I've written, samples of articles I've written, samples of work I've done while I was at CNN, some of the media that I've written for with print media, and also samples from podcasts that I've done, as well as interviews, radio interviews that people have done with me. And then photos of some of the places that I've traveled around the world. I did quite a bit of traveling while I worked for CNN, but now as a freelance writer for a couple of online magazines, I don't travel out of the country as much. So, but I still really, really enjoy going around and covering African-American heritage tourism, and you'll see some of that on my website.
Thank you very, very much. All right, well, actually, let's continue in this vein. Where can we find Amy? I know you put your website up there, but if, to continue the conversation, where can they find you? Social media?
So you can find me, I have a blog at rosenkranshistory.com, and you really need to follow the Maryland Women's Heritage Center on Facebook, because we have lots of events and different things that we're doing there.
Ivan, you were really great about putting all your contact information up, but we have been talking about sharing some of the facsimiles and some of this collection later this fall. So I'm going to plug our connection here and talk about the Edgar and Virginia Death exhibit. We are going to see a preview of that in August, and we're talking about parallel opportunities to see something at the library and come here to Westminster as well. Anything else we can add, or we're just going to keep our plan secret?
No, I look forward to it.
Okay, thank you. And then Scott, where can we find you?
We're good. My website's down right now. It's being worked on.
Oh, no one can find Scott. No. All right, well, thank you very much. Please, a round of applause for our speakers tonight.
Join the discussion. If you would like to participate in one of the upcoming monthly programs, visit virginiapoebicentennial.org to register for our next live interactive session. June is wedding month, and our discussion centers on marriage. Our guests include historical fiction writer Lynn Cullen, author of the best-selling novel Mrs. Poe. We also welcome the return of Dean Knight from the Poe Museum, and Susan Elizabeth Sweeney will share the connection between Edgar Allan Poe and the Nabokov novel Lolita. In July, we'll explore mourning rites and traditional feminine in mid-19th century America with Hayden Peters, jewelry scholar and historian curating artofmourning.com, then delve deep into cemetery lore with Dying to Tell Their Stories blog historians. We'll also preview some of the memento mori and death tableau from the upcoming Edgar and Virginia Poe death exhibit. All sessions are recorded live. And save the date, the Virginia Poe Bicentennial Gothic Tea Party and Reception, a 200th birthday commemoration and concert, is Saturday, August 13th at Westminster Hall in Burying Ground. Tickets for the Bicentennial are also on sale now. Visit virginiapoebicentennial.org for details.